Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather. On today's episode, we're talking about the Rose Larner case. Warning, we will be speaking of assault, murder, and cannibalism. Rose Larner was the middle child of 3 children. She shared a first name with her mother, also Rose. And Rose loved her brothers with all her heart. She always told them that she loved them, she enjoyed cooking meals for them, and for the most part, they actually really got along. They all grew up in Lansing, Michigan, but when she was just 4 years old, her parents would divorce. Divorce does affect children differently, but as far as I know, it didn't really affect her that badly as a child. She would spend time with both of her parents, and would be described as an excellent student by her teachers and excelled at spelling bees. As Rose got older, she was your typical teenager. She was moody, she was always on the phone with her friends, especially Ginger Bailey and Billy Brown, her best friends. But she would talk to anyone who would listen. She loved to talk and rarely stopped talking. Billy Brown she had known since 5th grade. They played tag as kids, built tree forts, explored the woods, and they had a really close friendship. It said they also both had crushes on each other, and I believe they also shared their first kiss with each other, but they were more friends than anything else. Her other best friend was Ginger Bailey, who she had known since 3rd grade. And Ginger was a tough kid, and being friends with Rose, who was loud and sometimes obnoxious, this meant they were perfect together. But since they both had strong personalities, they were also the type of friends who fought with each other. Ginger would recall that they fought almost weekly, but Rose would always be the person to pick up the phone and call just so they could make up because they really valued their friendship more than any of their petty fights. Rose would be diagnosed with being hyperactive in her early teens, and nothing slowed her down. Her friends and her parents would say that Rose was quite outspoken to the point that she actually angered a lot of people. She was fearless and opinionated, and if she didn't like something, you definitely would know it. Now, even though Rose sounds like she was a bit of a handful, she was also really generous and always there for people who needed her. Her former stepmother said that sometimes she was like 2 different people, sometimes crabby and obnoxious, but other times really sweet. Rose also really loved kids. She went to church twice a week and had aspirations to be a police officer. And as you can see, Rose's personality was a lot. Her mom also had a really hard time dealing with Rose on a daily basis, and she just didn't really like Rose's smart mouth or attitude. So she had exaggerated Rose's behavior just so she could get her admitted to Rivendell Psychiatric Hospital. Her mom thought this would really help Rose get stability and just slow her down a little bit. Rose would stay in Rivendell for about 3 months, and she really didn't want to go at first, but surprisingly, she didn't mind it there. Unfortunately, it didn't do anything to curb her behavior. When she left, she actually got worse. She started to skip school a lot, and she also got arrested for shoplifting. Her mother thinks that Rose really wanted to be sent back to the center because she really liked it there. She thrived in a highly controlled environment, and she felt really safe. Now, instead of being allowed back to Rivendell, Rose enrolled to a different high school at 15, hoping to have a fresh start at a new place. But she really missed her friends Billy and Ginger, so she went back to her old school for the start of junior year. When Rose turned 16, she would drop out of high school completely. And this was a problem because Rose still wanted to be a police officer. So she tried to enroll in Harry Hill for academics and technology, but left after only 1 month. Then she signed up to join the U.S. Army. Now, it takes a while to hear back from the Army, so Rose enrolled in vocational training at Grand Rapids to finish her high school education. And she finally got caught up on her math, her English, and earned her GED in June of 1993. While on summer break, when Rose was 18, she was really trying to spread her wings. Friends and family gave her the nickname Vampire, and this was mostly because she loved to stay out late and really just preferred to be awake at night than during the day. Rose's mom did give Rose a curfew to be home by 1 a.m., and she also gave her a pager so she could still contact Rose, and this seemed to work well. Then Rose met a man named John Ortis Cohey. By most accounts, John would be described as a friend of Billy Brown's. He was an aspiring rapper, and to Rose, he was very handsome. Rose was immediately infatuated with John. They would start dating, and Rose, John, and Billy Brown would all hang out together. And they spent most of their time at Billy's house, and it seemed like her life was really centered around these people. Now, John has a blog now that we will discuss later, but for now, as the story goes, Billy and John are friends. Now, Rose's brother didn't like this. He was concerned with Rose and the direction that she was headed, but Rose didn't listen because she loved John and loved hanging around with Billy. By September, Rose heard back from the army and they refused her application based on her stay at Rivendell. And this was upsetting to Rose, but she was occupying all her time now with John and Billy, so she kind of put it out of her mind quickly and also made no further plans for her future. She just wanted to be with John. Now, at some point while they were dating, Rose asked her mom if John could move in because he needed a place to stay. Rose's mom reluctantly said yes, because Rose said that he was a really nice guy, so she trusted her. Rose was also 18, and her mom didn't want to fight with her, so John moved in. One day, not long after he moved in, Rose's mom came home to see guns laying out everywhere with wads of cash. Turns out he was a drug dealer, so Rose's mom immediately kicked him out. John and Rose ended up breaking up after he moved out. He basically started to distance himself from Rose and eventually wouldn't return her calls at all. Rose was crushed. She was obsessed with him, and the more he ignored her, the more upset she got. And the more upset she got, the more she tried to get his attention. In late November, Rose would randomly show up at a party that she knew he was at, and this made him furious. They got into an argument, and Rose would eventually leave, but not before she rammed her van into his white truck. This obviously angered John even more, and he made a threat that day that he was going to kill her. Billy was there as well, and he would drive Rose back to Lansing. Then on December 6, 1993, Rose would get home from work from her new job at a pizzeria around 11:30 p.m. Her brother would be asleep on the couch when Rose walked in, and she threw her hat at him, which woke him up. So he remembers that he heard Rose go into the dining room to make a phone call. Jamie, her brother, would overhear Rose on the phone having what sounded like an argument with someone, which ended with Rose telling the other person that she loved John. When that call was over, Rose would tell her brother that she loved him, and she left. Now, Rose telling her brother that she loved him was not unusual. This was something that she did often. Then around 1:30 a.m., Rose would go into the convenience store where her mom was working. Her mother had taken on a second part-time job on top of a 60-hour work week just so she could provide for her kids. While Rose was there, she told her mom she was going to go to her friend Keith's house, who was apparently a new boyfriend or a new friend. The night was cold and damp, so her mom told her to take the van, but Rose declined and insisted that she was fine. Sadly, that was the last time Rose's mother saw her daughter ever again. Rose didn't come home that night. And her mother would call Keith, and Keith informed her that Rose never actually showed up the night before. She also calls Billy, but apparently he hasn't been home either. Rose's mother was hopeful that Billy and Rose were together, so she tried not to worry, but her mother's intuition just knew something was wrong, so she called police right away to make a missing persons report. When Rose hadn't gone into the pizzeria for work on Tuesday, it was apparent that she truly was missing. A girl who made dozens of phone calls a day, called her friends nonstop, was suddenly silent. And this was completely out of character for her. By Thursday, Billy's mother had called and said that Billy hadn't actually seen Rose. All of her friends thought she was with Billy, but Billy thought that she was with John. John would say that they broke up and he had no idea where she was. Police would search for Rose everywhere and even had helicopters flying around for any signs of Rose. They would finally make a public plea for any tips and the assistance to locate Rose Larner. They would end up getting over 100 tips, and some were useless, like they saw Rose at the mall. Someone said that they'd find her in the river, so police divers would go out and do searches on all the bodies of water. Another tip came in that Rose's body was in a private gravel pit, so police brought in search dogs to find Rose's remains. And they almost thought that they had something because the initials RL were spray painted into a cement drain nearby, and a shirt similar to what Rose wore was also found nearby. But again, there was no signs of Rose. The only thing that a lot of these tips had in common was that they all mentioned either Billy Brown or John Kehoe. Police learned that Rose spoke with John the night she went missing, so they asked him again where he was. John said that he was actually on a date that night, and it was a double date with Billy Brown. Police brought Billy into the station for further questioning, and he swore he knew nothing and had not seen or heard from Rose. He corroborated John's alibi and said that they were together on a double date. Now, police had no proof or evidence as to where Rose was. This case was at a standstill for 2.5 years. During this time, police did learn that not only were Billy and John friends, but they were in business together selling drugs all over Michigan, which John has also denied on his blog. Now, police didn't have proof the men were involved in Rose's disappearance, but they knew that something was off. They would put more and more pressure specifically on Billy, as they thought he seemed like he had something he needed to get off his chest. Then around April of 1996, Billy calls up the detectives working on the case. He claims the night Rose disappeared involved drugs, sex, and murder. Now, why did he wait so long to go to the police all these years later? He claims he feared that the police were zeroing in on making an arrest, and he now wanted to clear his name. He then goes on to say that parts of Rose's body were probably still inside John's grandparents' house. Billy made sure to tell the police that he wasn't the killer, but it was John that killed Rose. They were in fact not on a double date, but instead were with Rose at John's grandparents' house. So Billy's story is as follows. On December 7th, just before midnight, Billy runs into Rose somewhere near the convenience store. And remember, Rose had stopped there to talk to her mother before walking to her friend Keith's house. Billy convinced her to come and hang out with him, so they went back to his house. While there, Rose begged Billy to page John. She really wanted to see him, so Billy would page John and ask him to call the house because Rose really wanted to talk. It's mainly reported that John says the only way that he would agree to seeing Rose is if she agreed to have sex with both Billy and himself. Rose apparently agrees to this. She really wants to see John because she still loves him. I have read a transcript of one of Billy's interviews, which is slightly different. So when Billy and Rose were hanging out, Billy was hoping to have sex with Rose. He figured that if he paged John like Rose asked and did this favor for her, maybe that he would get sex with Rose. So when John called Billy after being paged, John would say that he didn't want to talk to Rose. But John and Billy would have a discussion, and they would agree that if she wanted to see John, she would need to have sex with both of them. According to Billy, she said yes. And his brothers, Dan and Derek, were apparently there and heard this conversation, as per this transcript. John would then drive over to Billy's house around 3 a.m. and pick up Rose and Billy in his brother's truck. While they were driving, John allegedly pulls the truck over down a dark, deserted country road, and with Rose's head in Billy's lap, she had sex with John in the cab of the truck. After that was done, John then drives to a convenience store and brings a bag back filled with a fillet knife, 2 bottles of charcoal lighter fluid, a hatchet, and trash bags. Now, nobody knew what was in these bags, and Billy claims he had no idea what was in them until later on in the night. Next, they go to John's grandparents' house, where Billy assumed that they were just going to go party. John's grandparents weren't home. They're snowbirds and have gone to Arizona for the winter. Billy said that he had come prepared to party with pot and Coke, not Coca-Cola. One version of the story is that John and Rose have sex again. Then all 3 of them would all take a shower together. A different version says that it was in the shower when John tries to have sex with Rose, and Rose declines, saying that she's changed her mind about the threesome, which angers John. So while in the shower, John also tries to pass Billy a fillet knife from the top ledge of the shower. But Billy's confused, so they exchanged confused looks before John put it back. When the shower was over, they all dried off and got dressed in the bathroom. John then leaves the bathroom and comes back with a cord. Now, Rose is brushing her hair at this point, and Billy is still in the bathroom. So Rose starts giggling when John wraps this cord around her neck. Rose thinks she's playing along and pulls this cord down farther around her neck as she has no idea what's about to happen. John then pulls the cord tight, places his knee on her back for leverage, and chokes her to death. Rose falls to the floor, and all Billy can do is ask, "Why?" And John responds saying, quote, "That bitch has got to go, and that's what's going to happen," end quote. John then puts Rose's limp body back in the shower and cuts her throat with the fillet knife. Billy and John do some lines of drugs, and Billy throws up at the sight of Rose. John then laughs at Billy and continues to injure Rose's body. According to Billy, John uses the hatchet and a block of wood to chop Rose's limbs off. He then puts some of her body parts into the fireplace and burns them, and her abdomen in a large trash can. Now, John's friends, Sammy and Sammy's girlfriend, come by at some point and all hang out for about an hour, completely unaware that Rose's body is in various areas of the house. I believe this is the following day, but I can't confirm the time on this. I've also read that it took the boys 2 to 3 days to fully clean the house. Once they're finished cleaning the house, they drove 100 miles to Billy's family's property. And once there, they dig a hole, throw some logs in the hole as well as Rose's midsection, and then they light her on fire. They kept this fire going for upwards of 10 hours to make sure it burned completely. Now, Billy claims that John made a sandwich out of some of Rose's cooked flesh, topped it with mustard, and ate it, just to see what she tasted like. Once the fire was put out, they then filled trash bags with the ashes and spread the ashes along the highway on their way to Big Rapids, Michigan, where Tim lived, John's brother. According to Billy, Tim told them not to worry about the tools that they used and that he would take care of them, no problem. Then they all sat down and discussed that Tim would be John and Billy's alibi, and they would make sure to tell everyone that they were there with Tim in Big Rapids the night Rose vanished. After about 2 days, Billy and John leave to go to Florida for a few more days before returning home. I should point out the alibi that was discussed with them being with Tim was never actually used. Instead, John gave the story of a double date that didn't actually happen. And I'm not sure where the disconnect was on that part of the story, or if this was just something that Billy added later. Once police hear this story, they would issue a warrant for the arrest of Billy, Tim, and John. Now, Billy turned himself in right away, but John somehow hears of this warrant and he goes to hide in Mexico with his brother Tim. Meanwhile, police would also search the home of John's grandparents to try and get evidence that proves Billy's story is real. There was some evidence found in the basement sub-pump drain, but the main piece of evidence was a single drop of blood found in the bathroom on the wallpaper. That blood was tested and the DNA revealed to be human blood. Now, Rose's blood happened to be on file due to a sexual assault Rose went through 4 years earlier. So police were able to compare this blood droplet to Rose's sample, and it was confirmed to be Rose's blood on the wallpaper. This blood droplet was small and hidden amongst this big flowery wallpaper that the grandparents hadn't noted at all of these years. It was amazing that it was even found. The evidence in the drain was harder to test because it's believed to be ash from the fireplace. Some reports say it was tested to be human, but DNA couldn't be lifted. The fire pit at Billy's family cabin was also excavated as well, and there was trace evidence of bone there too. These fragments of bone were too small and too destroyed to be used for DNA, but it was confirmed to be human and of a person in their teens or early 20s. Investigators were thankfully able to track Tim's whereabouts to Battle Creek Nuevo, Laredo, Mexico, and he was brought back to the US and arrested. John was later found at La Mina, a bar south of Texas, in Mexico as well. According to John, he had been hiding out in an apartment and sometimes with his current girlfriend's family, who were linked to the drug cartel. John would be sent back to Michigan in 1996. Now, since Billy was the one to go to police, turn himself in, and gave investigators this story, Billy was offered a lesser sentence to testify against John. Billy was given only 1 year in prison for being an accessory to murder. John, on the other hand, who fled the United States, denied everything and said it was actually Billy who did everything. John claims he left Billy and Rose alone, and Billy killed Rose when she refused to have sex with him. Tim's lawyer fought for Tim, saying that he wasn't an accessory and had no idea what John and Billy had done. He admitted that Billy and John came and visited, but they didn't inform him of any murder. The boys would spend 2 days together before Tim drove John and Billy to the bus station in Grand Rapids, where they bought tickets to Florida because they wanted to go somewhere hot and sunny. Now, I don't think there was any solid evidence one way or another proving who was the real killer. There were witnesses who testified against John, though, speaking of John's character, saying how much he hated Rose and how angry he was because she had crashed into his truck. One of Billy's brothers, named Daniel, testified that Billy had called the night of the murder to say that, quote, something had gone wrong and Rose was not coming back. His brother asked if Billy was going to come home, and Billy said that he didn't know. He went on to say that if he doesn't come back, then Daniel should call the police and tell them that John had done something to him and Rose. But when Billy came home, they decided not to go to the police. Now, remember when I said John had a blog? Well, this blog is where you would find most of John's side of the story. The original court transcripts aren't online, so I don't know what the defense said or how they portrayed their side of the case. But on John's blog, John said that he wasn't even friends with Billy at all. John said that he was friends with Billy's older brother named Russell. He has this whole story about their life as rappers and clubbing and living in a trap house. John apparently never hung out with Billy until the night of the incident, which contradicts everything because all the information out there is that Rose, Billy, and John hung out together and were all friends. John also claims that he was never Rose's boyfriend. Rose and him were just friends, and they would rob people together, do drugs together, and have sex, but were never dating. He claims he had other girlfriends at the time, and he also has never lived with Rose, only spent the night once or twice. Now, as far as that night goes, he claims Billy begged him to hang out that night because Rose promised Billy that she would have sex with him, Billy, if he could get John to come over. For some reason, John went, even though he also claims that they weren't friends and he hated Rose. Something the jury didn't hear was that Billy first pointed the finger at a different person named Abe Garcia. Billy admitted that he knew the police were zeroing in on him, and he wanted the suspicion redirected and gave police Abe's name. And this information was excluded from the trial, so the jury don't know that Billy was basically throwing other people under the bus and not just John.
Do you remember telling them that?
Yes, I do.
Did you tell them that in order to create suspicion it was Abe Garza that was responsible for the death of Rose Larner?
No, I didn't.
Why did you give them the name?
I told them that the conversation was going that basically he was pointing the finger at me, and I said it as to, well, why would you look at somebody like me who's known her for all this time when there's other people, and there's been numerous occasions where other people have attacked her and tried to harm her.
So because the officer was pointing the finger at you?
Yes.
Because the officer was saying that you're responsible?
Yes.
Because the officer was saying you could be charged with murder?
Yes.
And you could go to prison, I guess, for the rest of your life, right?
He wasn't saying that at the time. He wasn't.
But you knew that in your mind?
I knew that I would come up, yes.
So you knew to protect yourself?
Correct.
So you told them Abe Garza?
Yes.
So it was to remove suspicion from yourself, you gave them a name?
Yes.
Okay. And you knew at the time you gave them your name, that name, if your testimony is true today, that Abe Garza had nothing to do with it?
Yes, I did.
You had no compulsion in pointing the finger at somebody else that you knew in your mind to be perfectly innocent, didn't you?
So even though Billy is kind of a liar as well, he only ended up getting 1 year of prison for being an accessory to murder. Billy now goes by the name Bill, and he's still in Michigan and owns several tattoo shops, one with his daughter. John got a life sentence without parole. The worst part of the trial, other than hearing about the gory details, was that John laughed loudly when the jury announced his guilty verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant, John Ortiz Beadle, guilty of first-degree premeditated.
Now, John has tried to appeal his sentence numerous times, and he really thinks that everyone is against him. And reading his blog, he kind of sounds like he's full of himself. He is not remorseful or even the least bit sorry that Rose lost her life that night. He also has a fiance now named Emerald, and she runs quite a few different social media accounts as well as a website that focuses on John's innocence. He has done podcasts and has also written a book called When Shit Hits the Fence, which I have not read and I probably never will. I don't want to spend my hard-earned money on something that supports a person who was involved in the murder of Rose. And his blog really shows me that he isn't a good person. Emerald, his fiance, has a petition on change.org to help John out of prison. It currently has 303 virtual signatures. As of 2022, this year, John appealed again, and as of August, it's still pending. I have a feeling this will probably get rejected too. It's been rejected so many times before, and it's so hard to get appeals approved. Once a jury makes a decision, it's almost impossible to get that changed, unless you have some groundbreaking new evidence. He also hasn't been the best inmate either and has been reprimanded multiple times. So I think he will be in there for a while. My thoughts? I really wish people would just own up to their actions and tell the truth. I know that's wishful thinking and will never happen, but it would be nice for people to take accountability and pay their price. What happened to Rose was so heartbreaking and so mindless. She was most likely killed over what? Sex? Being overbearing? Whatever it was, she did not deserve to die. As far as Billy getting such a small sentence, I do think the police needed someone to take the fall, and it was easier to convict John. They really couldn't have convicted Billy because there was no evidence to prove who took Rose's last breath. But when Billy comes up with the story that is backed up with blood and bone fragments, it just proves that the main parts of the story are true. She was killed at the grandparents' house and burned at the cabin. So now Billy is a witness, and yes, that means Billy gets freedom, but it also means at least there is some justice and someone's paying the price. And maybe that's not a good way of thinking of things. People should get a fair trial and be convicted only for the crimes they commit when proven guilty without a reasonable doubt. But for me, his involvement is enough that I think he deserves prison time. I do think they're both guilty, but at least we have John behind bars. What do you think? Should Billy have gotten more time? Do you think justice was served? Is it fair that John is in prison with such little evidence? Please let me know what you think in the comments. That's it for today. Thanks again for joining me here at Felony Spectator, and please hit subscribe to support my channel, as well as that little notification if you don't want to miss a future episode. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.